In the frozen chaos of Belgium's Ardennes forest, a lone sergeant commanded his paratroopers to prepare for battle by deliberately turning their backs on the enemy lines. December 17, 1944. The air above the snowy ridge near Bastogne was dangerously still. Technical Sergeant Michael Hargrove of the 101st Airborne 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment watched his exhausted 12-man crew beginning the gruesome task of digging protective positions in the brutally hard sub-zero earth. After a few minutes of scraping frozen topsoil, Hargrove stepped forward and uttered two words that seemed to defy every rule of military engagement: face rearward. The shock among the men was absolute. They had been taught the fundamentals since basic training at Fort Benning. Every manual, every grueling field exercise, every grizzled veteran's advice emphasized the unchangeable core tenet of combat engineering. A defensive fighting position must confront the threat. The firing arc should sweep across the enemy's likely approach. Protection must shield the rear. Here, in the middle of the German offensive, Hargrove was demanding the exact opposite. Private Collins, his breath puffing white clouds into the dim light, motioned vehemently toward the hazy northwestern distance. That direction was where the V Panzer Army was advancing, where the deadly thrust of the German Bulge operation was aimed. "Sarge, the Germans are coming from over there," Collins stated, confusion thick in his voice. "We always dig toward the action, right?" Hargrove, whose eyes held the weary wisdom of too many campaigns, simply shook his head. "You will dig facing southeast," he ordered, his voice flat and unwavering. "We are turning our position completely around." The exhausted paratroopers exchanged glances, a mixture of disbelief and mounting dread. They had been isolated and surrounded for 2 agonizing days. Their already stretched supply lines were breaking. German reconnaissance and artillery spotters had already mapped the entire ridgeline with terrifying precision. Now their seasoned squad leader was asking them to construct their final protective shelter in a manner that seemed guaranteed to expose them directly to the advance of enemy riflemen. But Hargrove carried a terrifying lesson learned during the brutal, often forgotten fighting in Italy. A realization the meticulously detailed U.S. Army training manuals had entirely failed to incorporate. It was a secret to survival, forged in the heat of countless shellings, that distinguished the men who returned home from those who simply became names on a casualty list. Over the next 6 hours, as the men reluctantly complied, constructing their protective holes facing the quiet, less threatening south, the German military machine prepared its reply. They launched what would become the most intense, sustained artillery barrage the Ardennes sector had yet endured. 300 high-explosive shells would soon test Hargrove's radical reversal of doctrine. What was it that Hargrove had observed in Italy that contradicted everything the U.S. infantry taught? By the middle of December 1944, the unrelenting Allied surge across Western Europe had ground to a virtual halt, settling into an extended, thin line stretching across the densely wooded, snow-choked Ardennes forest. The 101st Airborne Division, still recovering and refitting from the tremendous losses suffered during Operation Market Garden 2 months prior, had finally been granted a respite. They were designated as a reserve formation, pulled back to relative safety near Reims, France. The men had been fully anticipating their first genuine extended rest since landing on D-Day, a well-deserved break after months of ceaseless campaigning. They were granted a mere 48 hours of peace. On December 16th, 3 synchronized German armies deploying over 200,000 highly motivated troops spearheaded a massive, unanticipated counteroffensive that ripped through the lightly defended American sectors. This surprise attack quickly became recognized as the Battle of the Bulge, named for the deep, salient penetration it drove into the Allied line. The 101st Airborne Division received immediate emergency deployment orders. By the evening of December 17th, Hargrove's regiment found themselves crammed into trucks, heading for Bastogne, a crucial crossroads town the Germans desperately needed to maintain momentum for their drive toward the sea. The defense of this particular road network presented a horrifying tactical reality for the American forces. German artillery methodology had undergone profound changes since the early fighting in 1942. The Wehrmacht had perfected complex, coordinated fire techniques, utilizing expert forward observers often equipped with superior radio communication gear and meticulously accurate terrain maps. A single spotter could effectively direct volleys from numerous separate artillery batteries simultaneously. This capability resulted in what frontline soldiers terrifyingly described as screaming metal rain, delivered with sickening precision onto American troop concentrations. The stark statistics painted a clear, grim picture of the conflict. Across the European theater of operations, German artillery was responsible for roughly 60% of all American combat wounds and deaths. By contrast, small arms fire, the rifles, machine guns, and pistols soldiers trained against endlessly, accounted for less than 30%. The true threat wasn't the enemy infantrymen you could spot and shoot back at. It was the unseen incoming shells launched miles away from hidden positions. U.S. Army standard procedure for constructing defensive positions had evolved primarily from lessons learned during World War I trench warfare, subsequently refined through training exercises back home. Field Manual 740, often called the Infantry Bible, provided explicit instructions. The defensive position must be aimed toward the enemy's most probable route of attack. The soldier's primary firing zone must cover his assigned forward sector. The manual included detailed, non-negotiable diagrams illustrating fighting holes dug with the most substantial earthwork, protection facing the rear. A built-up parapet of earth or sandbags guarded the front, leaving a critical V-shaped aperture aimed squarely at the enemy. This arrangement was logically sound for maximizing visibility and firing angles when engaging advancing enemy infantry. It allowed unrestricted throwing of defensive fragmentation grenades forward. It consolidated the required defensive firepower exactly where the threat was anticipated. But had this doctrine become obsolete? Lieutenant Colonel John Davies, the battalion commander for the 506th 2nd Battalion, later documented his findings in an after-action report. Our men were expertly trained to engage infantry. They understood every facet of small unit maneuvering, fire discipline, and establishing crisscrossing fields of fire. What they were catastrophically unprepared for was the modern reality that they were exponentially more likely to perish from an unseen shell than from a German rifleman they could potentially eliminate. The German artillery spotters forming a ring around Bastogne held the geological advantage of the high ground. They enjoyed unobstructed sight lines onto the American defensive sectors and possessed massive quantities of ammunition. In the early stages of the winter offensive, German forces had committed nearly all of their strategic artillery resources. Understanding this attack represented their last desperate gamble to force a negotiated settlement before overwhelming Allied production capabilities rendered further resistance futile. For the exhausted paratroopers of the 101st, this created an impossible dilemma: If they dug in according to the manual, facing the enemy, they could fight effectively against an infantry charge. But the moment the inevitable artillery barrage commenced, and it always commenced, their position instantly transformed into a deadly trap. The conventional foxhole architecture, with its primary protection to the rear and its wide opening toward the front, acted like a perfect funnel. This geometry channeled the effects of the blast wave and high-velocity shrapnel directly into the occupied space whenever shells detonated immediately in front of the position, which was precisely where German spotters were trained to direct their fire. Hargrove had personally witnessed the brutal consequences of this design flaw in Italy. He had watched men die inside perfectly constructed foxholes. These weren't casualties from direct hits. Those were usually instantly unsurvivable, regardless of design, but from near misses, shells landing 10, 15, or 20 feet away, distances that should have offered a decent chance of survival. Yet the shrapnel always found them, following the deadly, predictable geometry of their own defensive setup straight down into the protective hole. This devastating pattern forced Hargrove to radically rethink artillery exposure. He stopped viewing the relentless shelling as random, inevitable death from above. Instead, he analyzed it as a solvable physics challenge, one that required a simple geometric counterbalance. The German artillery observers, peering through their specialized Scherenfernrohr scissor telescopes across the snowscape, felt entirely confident in their target acquisition. Oberlieutenant Friedrich Bauer, who coordinated fire for the 18th Volksgrenadier Division's supporting artillery, was a veteran. He had precisely directed devastating barrages against British units at Caen, American positions in the Hirchen Forest, and Soviet trenches outside Warsaw. He thoroughly understood American paratrooper combat methods. They were aggressive, superbly trained, and frighteningly effective in close-quarters fighting. But they were also fatally predictable. American doctrine demanded standardization across all fighting units. They dug identical positions, established identical defensive networks, and reacted to artillery strikes in the same way every time. This uniformity, Bauer knew, made them deeply vulnerable. "They will inevitably dig facing us," Bauer instructed his forward observation teams on the morning of December 18th. "When the preparatory barrage begins, they will retreat into their holes. We will first bracket their positions with ranging shots, then systematically walk the heavy barrage across their entire defensive line. This is standard procedure." German artillery experts had meticulously studied captured copies of American field manuals. They understood U.S. defensive doctrine perhaps better than many American field-grade officers. What the Wehrmacht learned was that the standard American fighting hole, while superb for small arms defense, inherently created a predictable, localized vulnerability zone. A high-explosive shell detonating in the expected zone, that is, directly in front of a forward-facing foxhole, would drive its lethal shrapnel downward and backward, following the conical pattern of the explosion, straight into the hole's occupants. Simultaneously, the blast wave itself would follow the easiest path of flow, channeling through the essential front opening for visibility and weapon use. The Germans had verified this phenomenon through testing. When they knew exactly how their adversaries would orient their positions, they could calculate precise, optimized firing solutions. Direct hits were not necessary. They only needed to drop shells consistently into the defined, predicted zone, typically 15 to 20 feet immediately in front of the defensive line. The foxholes themselves, ironically, would then complete the work of killing their occupants. For Hargrove's squad, the rising terror was almost unbearable.
Private Eddie Morrison had narrowly survived Market Garden when a large German 88mm shell landed beside his Foxhole but turned out to be a dud. Private First Class Robert Chen remembered his closest friend dying near Eindhoven in a perfect, regulation-built position after a near miss drove a large, fist-sized metal fragment straight into his chest. Every man possessed such stories. Every soldier knew someone who had perished while attempting to take cover in their protective hole. They had been rigorously taught that superior technique guaranteed safety. Dig deep, reinforce the walls properly, and maintain overhead shielding. Yet the unfeeling mathematics of high-explosive artillery seemed to disregard all proper technique. The shells still found their way in. Then came Hargrove's impossible instruction. Reverse it. Dig facing away. "Sarge, this truly borders on madness," Corporal Davis protested. "If we face away, how will we see them approach? How can we defend our assigned sector?" "We will deploy forward observation teams," Hargrove responded, his logic clear. "We will rotate watches. 2 men will remain forward at all times with a field telephone concealed and observing. When they report enemy movement, we abandon the holes and sprint out to established fighting positions." He paused, looking each man directly in the eye. "And when the barrage begins," he finished, "then and only then will you understand precisely why this is necessary." By twilight on December 17th, every member of the squad had finished constructing a defensive position oriented precisely in the wrong direction, according to every U.S. Army manual. The German forward observers, noting the unusual construction through their telescopes, marked the oddity, but dismissed it as sloppy or fatigued construction. What they failed to grasp was that this reversal was a conscious innovation. Why did the soldiers trust a choice that seemed to guarantee their deaths? Before we proceed with the harrowing details of the impending bombardment, I would genuinely appreciate knowing where you're viewing this story from and what you know about the evolution of small unit defensive tactics in World War II. Please drop a comment below and tell me if you have ever encountered documentation about these non-conventional foxhole techniques previously. If you are finding these detailed historical examinations of infantry combat during the Second World War compelling, please remember to hit that subscribe button. Bringing these meticulously researched stories to light takes considerable effort here at Winds of Thought, and your support makes every hour worthwhile. The barrage began exactly at 04:45 hours on December 18th. Hargrove was wide awake, his nerves taut, when the first round screeched toward the ridge. The sound started as a deep, distant grinding, reminiscent of an accelerating freight train, quickly escalating into an ear-splitting, howling shriek that vibrated deep in the skull.
6 seconds. That was the only warning. Then the entire world seemed to detonate. The initial salvo walked methodically across the ridgeline, impacting roughly 300 yards to their left, in the sector where Easy Company had dug in, strictly adhering to standard textbook doctrine. Massive orange fireballs blossomed from the frozen ground. The resulting concussion waves slammed into Hargrove's position like physical blows. Snow, churned earth, and shattered pine splinters rocketed skyward into the pre-dawn gloom. "To the holes!" Hargrove roared, his voice barely audible above the rising clamor. "Everyone down now!" Private Collins and Private Morrison, the 2 men on forward surveillance, scrambled frantically back from their hidden observation post, sprinting the final yards before diving headfirst into their respective foxholes. Hargrove dropped instantly into his own protective position, turning his body to face southeast, directly opposite the German lines. Every fiber of his being, every hour of grueling training, screamed that he was violating the sacred rules of warfare. The second salvo adjusted its range 300 yards closer. The German forward artillery observers were systematically walking the fire pattern across the full length of the American defensive line. This was classic, textbook counter-infantry artillery usage. Start beyond the target, accurately correct based on the observed impacts, and then sustain a massive, devastating fire pattern across the confirmed enemy position. Each German 105mm shell was packed with approximately 4.8 pounds of TNT and designed to fragment into roughly 1,500 pieces of high-velocity, lethal shrapnel. Within a 30-foot radius, virtually every fragment carried deadly kinetic energy. At 50 feet, most fragments still posed a serious danger. At 75 feet, survivors were typically in what artillery experts grimly termed the wounding zone. The third salvo landed 200 yards away, rapidly closing the gap. Through the terrifying pandemonium, Hargrove could distinctly hear the sounds of shouting and screaming emanating from Easy Company's sector. They were sustaining heavy casualties. Men sheltered in their conventionally constructed, forward-facing foxholes were being wounded and killed by shells that hadn't even struck their positions directly. The very design intended to protect them was betraying their survival. The geometry had failed. The fourth salvo impacted just 100 yards away. "Sergeant," Corporal Davis screamed from the next hole over, his voice raw with fear. "They're finding our range!" Hargrove pressed his face firmly into the cold, frozen dirt at the reinforced southeastern end of his foxhole. His entire squad was following his example, staking their lives on his unconventional judgment, their backs turned resolutely toward the enemy they had been meticulously trained to engage. He could now feel the immense impact forces vibrating violently through the ground, rhythmic, powerful hammer blows that made the earth heave and shudder. Then, the fifth salvo landed 50 yards to their left. The German artillery had finally zeroed in on their exact sector. The first shell aimed at their position detonated 23 feet immediately in front of Corporal Davis's foxhole, precisely the location where trained German forward observer would anticipate finding the critical opening of a standard American defensive position. The 105mm high-explosive round detonated instantly on impact, creating a blast crater roughly 4 feet deep and 8 feet across the frozen ground. The blast wave initially expanded outward in a sphere from the detonation point, but the shrapnel, the terrifying swarm of 1,500 lethal fragments, followed highly ballistic trajectories governed entirely by physics and geometric principles. In an orthodox foxhole design, facing forward toward the enemy, Davis would have been situated directly within the primary fragmentation cone. The shrapnel would have swept instantly through the wide opening of his position like a burst from a massive shotgun. The powerful blast wave would have similarly channeled down the same aperture, creating catastrophic overpressure inside the confined space, rupturing organs, lungs, and eardrums. Instead, both the intense shrapnel shower and the powerful blast wave slammed directly into the solid rear wall of Davis's reversed foxhole. The reinforced layers of packed earth and log shielding absorbed the full, deadly force. Davis, completely facing away from the detonation, was shielded by 2 feet of frozen, densely packed dirt and by the fundamental, life-saving geometry of his reversed position. "I'm okay," he yelled immediately, a mixture of shock and relief flooding his voice. "I'm entirely okay." Doctrine serves soldiers, not the other way around. The bombardment intensified dramatically. Over the next harrowing 45 minutes, German artillery units dropped an estimated 300 shells, specifically across their tiny sector. The forward observers had indeed accurately targeted the area. Shells impacted in precise, deadly patterns, 20 feet to the left, 20 feet to the right, 20 feet directly in front, 20 feet behind. German artillery doctrine dictated saturating a target area using a systematic grid pattern, ensuring that no defensive position within the impact zone could possibly escape the lethal effects. But in Hargrove's sector, the physics of geometry was working unexpectedly against the German calculations.
Private Chen's position sustained a near miss, impacting just 17 feet immediately to the front. He felt the colossal impact travel through his whole body, his vision momentarily turning blinding white from the flash. Dirt, snow, and shrapnel rattled harmlessly off his helmet and the protective rear wall. When his hearing painfully returned, he realized he had sustained no injuries. The enormous blast force had been perfectly channeled over and past his position. Morrison's hole endured 3 extremely close misses, 2 directly in front, 1 slightly to the left. Each time, he pressed his body fiercely against the reinforced rear wall, letting the dense earth absorb the energy that would have certainly killed him in a conventional position. The German shells were landing precisely where they were meant to land. The fatal error in the German calculation was that the American soldiers were not where the accepted German doctrine predicted they would be. At 0537 hours, the terrifying rhythm of the barrage abruptly shifted. The German artillery began extending their fire further south, seeking out other American defensive positions. In the sudden, profound relative silence, broken only by painful ringing in their ears and distant, fading explosions, Hargrove's squad cautiously began their roll call. Davis, confirmed. Chen, here. Morrison, good. Collins, check. One by one, every one of the 12 men reported back, alive and intact. A few sustained minor wounds from concussion debris and flying dirt. Private Rodriguez had a bloody laceration on his forehead where a splinter of timber from their overhead cover had struck him. Corporal Jackson sustained a painful burn trying to brush away a shell fragment that had landed near his hand, still glowing red-hot. But they had survived, every single man. Hargrove cautiously extracted himself from his foxhole and looked toward Easy Company's location, 300 yards down the ridge. Medics were already scrambling through the wreckage of the positions. He could clearly identify at least 4 men being moved on stretchers toward the rear aid station. The thick smoke and the acrid smell of high explosive hung heavy over the entire landscape. Lieutenant Barnes, the platoon leader, materialized through the drifting smoke and falling snow, his face pale and drawn with shock. Hargrove, what in the devil's name is going on? Why are none of your men bleeding? It's simply different geometry, sir, Hargrove replied quietly, standing amid the relative calm of his squad's position. Barnes stared, utterly confused, at the squad's strange, backwards-facing foxholes, then back toward the horrific scene of casualties in the adjacent sector. His expression transformed from complete confusion to dawning understanding, and then settled into something resembling horror at the undeniable implications. "Get your men fully prepared," Barnes finally managed, his voice strained. "The German infantry will follow immediately behind this barrage." But the successful test against the artillery had revealed something infinitely more critical than just immediate tactical survival. It had proven beyond doubt that 3 long years of universally accepted military doctrine might actually be the very thing killing soldiers who by all rights should have survived the engagement. Within 6 hours of the barrage ending, initial reports and word of mouth about Hargrove's squad and their strange backwards-facing foxholes had reached the battalion headquarters. By the late afternoon of December 19th, as German infantry patrols began cautiously testing the American defensive ring around Bastogne, 3 high-ranking officers from Division Intelligence arrived specifically to scrutinize the unusual positions. Captain Edward Sullivan, a former military engineering instructor from the United States Military Academy at West Point, who was attached to the 101st as a defensive tactics consultant, spent half an hour meticulously measuring blast patterns and analyzing the resultant geometry. He walked slowly between Hargrove's virtually intact positions and the adjacent, heavily damaged foxholes in the conventional sectors. He photographed every shell crater. He carefully documented the unique shrapnel impact patterns imprinted on the reinforced rear walls of the reversed positions.
The field manual presupposes that the primary and most immediate threat is direct fire. Small arms fire, possibly machine guns, perhaps direct fire anti-tank weapons. The established doctrine optimizes entirely for visibility and return fire against these threats. He pointed at the churned, cratered ground immediately in front of the position. But in this modern stage of warfare, indirect fire, artillery, and mortars is the dominant killer. We have possessed these statistical figures since 1943, yet we have failed to adopt our core defensive doctrine to match the reality of the actual threat profile. What the detailed field testing revealed was a fundamental and deadly misalignment between training and battlefield reality. The conventional Foxhole design created what he clinically termed a fragmentation funnel. When powerful high-explosive rounds detonated within the forward zone, the natural target area for German artillery spotters, the position's own architectural geometry directed both the shrapnel and the concussive blast effects inward, straight into the space occupied by the soldiers. The underlying physics were both elegant and entirely ruthless. 105 mm shell impacting 20 feet in front of a traditionally oriented foxhole would project its primary cone of fragmentation at a precise angle that swept clean through the position's opening. The corresponding blast wave, seeking the path of least resistance to dissipate its enormous energy, would channel through the exact same opening with tremendous, lung-collapsing force. Soldiers who were taking the deepest cover inside their foxhole, meticulously adhering to every detail training prescribed, were inadvertently placing themselves into the optimal zone for these deadly effects to reach them. Reversing the defensive geometry, Hargrove had discovered, instantly reversed the physics. With the opening of the foxhole facing away from the most probable impact zone, the very same shell, detonating 20 feet away, would drive its shrapnel and blast primarily into the solid, reinforced rear wall. The soldier, now facing that protective earthwork, was shielded by the densest mass, the earth itself. Shrapnel cannot easily bend around sharp corners or change trajectory dramatically after initial impact. The blast wave dispersed harmlessly against solid mass rather than channeling through a narrow gap. Crucially, Sullivan emphasized in his detailed report to the division headquarters, this configuration does not significantly compromise defensive capability against a direct infantry assault. Defenders can easily maintain effective observation posts positioned forward of their protective positions and move quickly to established fighting positions when immediate direct fire threats materialize. The artillery threat, which typically provides several seconds of warning, and the infantry threat, which requires visual confirmation, operate on vastly different timescales, thereby permitting defenders to optimize their response for each threat separately. The breakthrough was immediately circulating through highly informal channels. Sergeants who had witnessed the results were talking to sergeants in neighboring companies. Men who had survived Hargrove's devastating barrage were enthusiastically demonstrating the technique to men in entirely different regiments. By December 20th, dozens of scattered squads across the immense 101st Defensive Perimeter were experimenting rapidly with modified foxhole orientations. The Germans soon noted the peculiar change, though they could not immediately discern its full significance. Forward observers reported seeing scattered American positions that appeared structurally incorrect or unexplainably oriented away from the enemy. The true implications only became apparent when subsequent artillery strikes against these modified positions proved drastically less effective than predicted. Bauer, the artillery coordinator, began adjusting his precise firing solutions, mistakenly attempting to compensate for what he presumed was mass confusion, poor construction, or simply inadequate training among the American infantry. But adjusting coordinates couldn't override immutable laws of physics. How quickly does knowledge spread when survival is the only currency?
The critical lesson was rapidly spreading far beyond the frozen perimeter of Bastogne. An urgent infantry intelligence bulletin was being prepared for urgent distribution to every American unit operating in Europe. Field Manual 740 was not officially being rewritten. The bureaucracy governing military doctrine moves far too slowly for immediate battlefield necessities, but a crucial supplement was rushed into development: protection against indirect fire, alternative defensive position configurations. A single sergeant's radical, life-saving observation made under intense enemy fire was now being systematically analyzed and distributed throughout the largest military organization in American history. The pressing question remained: would the updated tactical knowledge reach other frontline units before those units faced their own inevitable, concentrated artillery barrages? Hargrove's squad remained steadfast in their defensive positions outside Bastogne until December 27th, the day when General Patton's Third Army finally shattered the aggressive German encirclement. During those 10 brutal days, they endured 7 additional sustained artillery bombardments. Each time, the reversed Foxholes provided the necessary protection, and each time, the subsequent casualty reports from adjacent units utilizing standard doctrine tragically confirmed the crucial difference that geometric innovation made. Final aggregated statistics collected from the entire Bastogne defensive period revealed a stark and compelling contrast. In sectors where modified foxhole designs, inspired by Hargrove's example, had been rapidly implemented, the casualties directly attributed to artillery fire dropped by approximately 40% compared to sectors where soldiers relied exclusively on standard field configurations.
The critical lesson was rapidly spreading far beyond the frozen perimeter of Bastogne. An urgent infantry intelligence bulletin was being prepared for urgent distribution to every American unit operating in Europe. Field Manual 7-40 was not officially being rewritten. The bureaucracy governing military doctrine moves far too slowly for immediate battlefield necessities, but a crucial supplement was rushed into development: protection against indirect fire, alternative defensive position configurations. A single sergeant's radical, life-saving observation made under intense enemy fire was now being systematically analyzed and distributed throughout the largest military organization in American history. The pressing question remained: would the updated tactical knowledge reach other frontline units before those units faced their own inevitable, concentrated artillery barrages? Hargrove's squad remained steadfast in their defensive positions outside Bastogne until December 27th, the day when General Patton's Third Army finally shattered the aggressive German encirclement. During those 10 brutal days, they endured 7 additional sustained artillery bombardments. Each time, the reversed foxholes provided the necessary protection, and each time, the subsequent casualty reports from adjacent units utilizing standard doctrine tragically confirmed the crucial difference that geometric innovation made. Final aggregated statistics collected from the entire Bastogne defensive period revealed a stark and compelling contrast. In sectors where modified foxhole designs, inspired by Hargrove's example, had been rapidly implemented, the casualties directly attributed to artillery fire dropped by approximately 40% compared to sectors where soldiers relied exclusively on standard field configurations. This figure naturally did not account for confounding variables, improvements in medical care, changes in supply availability, or variations in shell quality, but the correlation between design change and survival was so overwhelmingly significant that by January 1945, the backward-facing technique was being unofficially but widely adopted across multiple American infantry divisions. Hargrove himself survived the long, grinding war. He was honored with the Bronze Star Medal for his exemplary actions at Bastogne, although his citation specifically focused on outstanding leadership during sustained combat, rather than explicitly recognizing the crucial Foxhole innovation. He received a promotion to technical sergeant and concluded the European conflict with the 506th Regiment in Austria. After his discharge and return home to Pennsylvania, he pursued a career as a high school mathematics teacher, rarely discussing the details of his military service. Official institutional recognition of his innovation arrived much later. The infantry school located at Fort Benning incorporated modified defensive position designs into its formal training curriculum in late 1945, only after comprehensive, extensive testing at the school's dedicated artillery impact range. The officially revised doctrine finally conceded that the precise orientation of protective positions should prioritize the most probable threat vector, which, in modern, industrialized combat, overwhelmingly originated from indirect fire, not direct frontal assault. Post-war analysis undertaken by respected Army historians estimated that if modified foxhole techniques had been uniformly implemented across all frontline infantry divisions starting from December 1944, roughly 2,300 lives might have been conservatively saved during the final 6 months of intensive combat operations in Europe. While this number remains speculative, battle conditions fluctuate wildly, it represented a highly conservative projection based on documented casualty reduction rates. The lesson influenced far more than just American training. British Commonwealth forces examining detailed after-action reports from the Ardennes fighting began experimenting with similar, necessary modifications to their own defensive layouts. The technique was formally included in tactical manuals distributed during the subsequent Korean War, although the drastically different terrain and fighting conditions necessitated further adaptation and refinement. What cemented Hargrove's innovation as truly significant was its genesis. It arose from raw, direct observation of deadly reality, not from abstract theoretical engineering analysis. He was not a trained engineer, nor was he a professional tactics instructor. He was a sergeant who had watched too many of his men perish and posed one deceptively simple question. What if we are optimizing our defenses against the wrong threat entirely? The answer, proven under a deluge of enemy shells, saved hundreds of lives. In 1989, military historians from the U.S. Army Center of Military History conducted a comprehensive interview with Hargrove, then 68 years old, for an official oral history project documenting critical infantry innovations from the Second World War. When asked specifically about the now famous backwards foxholes, he maintained his characteristic modesty. "I just paid rigorous attention," he recounted. "The heavy shells were killing substantially more men than the bullets were. It simply seemed logical to seek protection against the weapon that was actually doing the primary killing. That simple, pragmatic observation, that survival demands defending against the existing threat, not merely the theoretical threat that your training prepared you for,
became an enduring case study in rapid military adaptation that is still taught today at the infantry school. War ultimately reduces the complex concept of survival to the most fundamental questions of physics and geometry. The precise angle of a shell's terrifying trajectory, the specific density of frozen, compacted earth, and the simple direction a soldier chooses to face when the world disintegrates around him. Hargrove's remarkable innovation succeeded because he understood that doctrine exists to serve soldiers, not the reverse. When following rigid procedure becomes paramount over the mission's success, when adherence to the manual is valued above coming home alive, then the organization has fundamentally lost its crucial capacity to adapt. And adaptation, quick, brutal,
And adaptation, quick, brutal, and intelligent adaptation, is the defining factor that separates armies that ultimately win from armies that just fight incredibly hard before they lose. Survival requires facing the right threat. The backwards foxholes were not the product of clever engineering or intellectual theory. They were the result of courageous attention, noticing that the deadliest killer on the battlefield was the one everyone trained to ignore. They represented the courage to reject 3 full years of institutionalized knowledge because the undeniable evidence right in front of them demanded a change. Every military organization throughout history has wrestled with this persistent tension between the need for strict standardization and the crucial imperative of battlefield adaptation. Standardized doctrine serves vital purposes. It enables massive forces to coordinate actions. It preserves the collective wisdom learned by previous costly generations. It prevents every single unit from having to laboriously reinvent basic, necessary tactics. Yet, doctrine, if left unchallenged, can rapidly become a deadly trap, especially when the conditions of the battlefield evolve far faster than the contents of the manuals. 1 squad, 12 handmade protective positions, 300 incoming enemy artillery shells, 0 fatal casualties. Sometimes, against all conventional wisdom, survival absolutely requires facing the perceived wrong direction. Sometimes the most life-saving decision you can make is to trust the evidence of your own eyes, even if that evidence contradicts everything you have been meticulously taught. And sometimes the tiny, crucial difference between returning home to Pennsylvania and being permanently interred in the frozen fields of Belgium comes down to nothing more complex than which direction your protective position is facing when the terrifying shells begin to fall. If you found this detailed story as genuinely fascinating as I did while researching and analyzing the sources, I would truly appreciate it if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel BTB Stories. There are dozens more incredible, often untold stories from the conflicts of World War II that deserve to be remembered and brought to light, and I commit to bringing you a new deep dive every day. What should I investigate and cover next in our series? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below.